class. Okay, let's start our next part on making a living, subsistence strategies. This is part 3. We're going to talk about the two types of societies that evolved after the hunting and gathering societies. We'll talk about horticulturalists and pastoralists and how they each evolved from hunters and gatherers differently for environmental reasons. First, let's talk about horticulturalists. The way that horticulturalists make a living is that they grow crops and hunt small game. They do some trading and animal domestication, which means breeding animals, and their communities grow multiple crops to consume within their smaller community. So the crops include things like corn, also gardens like tomatoes and beets, carrots, wheat, grain, tobacco, coffee, etc. Those kinds of crops. They hunt small game like rodents, rabbit, squirrel, wild pigs, and boar, though those are sort of large for human beings to catch on their own. And they did some hunting of things like snakes and things like that as well, depending on where they're at. And I shouldn't say did as in past tense, because there are still some horticulturalists in the world today, especially in South America and some parts of Africa and Asia. With horticulturalists, they can get as large as in the hundreds, usually somewhere between 100 and 200 to 250. And you can imagine why. They're not hunting and gathering every day to just gather the resources or hunt the resources that are right there near them, but they're growing things in their space, in their location, so that they don't have to work so hard to bring resources home to sort of ensure that they will always have the food that they need for their family and the items that they need to build their homes out of mud-based and clay-based bricks. And also they use palm tree fronds, which are the leaves, for their roofs and other materials like that that are all within their vicinity. But because they can grow their crops locally, they can actually build somewhat more permanent structures than our hunters and gatherers had interested in doing or could do. In terms of life chances or access to necessary resources, those are all immediate and relatively easy. They're located here in tropical areas where crops can grow and communities can really remain locally. So they're tropical and a bit subtropical with good growing seasons year round. Horticulturalists exclusively are in parts of the world where they have a constant growing season of rice, potatoes, grain, fruits and vegetables that are needed, and where the jungle and the forest actually provide shelter and provide enough resources for tools for growing of their crops, as well as for building their dwellings and their homes. The tools and technology that they have are simple handmade tools for gardening and hunting, a little bit more complex than hunters and gatherers, but not much. They have more complex tools for irrigation. So what horticulturalists figured out when they were first, of course, hunters and gatherers, was that if you planted seeds that fell from trees, they would grow. If you dug into the earth and aerated the earth by shifting the soil around, more crops could grow in the same place over and over again. They also learned that if you kept growing the same thing over and over again in the same spot, that eventually it wouldn't grow very well. So after about 5 to 12 years, crops won't grow in the same place. And if any of you have had gardens or have family members who have gardens, they'll often tell you that we can't keep growing the same thing without replacing the soil or without replenishing it with things. And that's why you might have compost and use fertilizer to really provide the nutrients. Well, what horticulturalists figured out, and they figured it out when they saw natural fires occur, is when there was a forest fire and all of the leaves and brush and even their crops were demolished by the fire, within a couple of years, that soil was richer and more plentiful than ever before, because the ash, as it slowly seeped into the soil, actually created a fertilizer and was regenerating. So horticulturalists engage in a technology called slash and burn to provide fertilization. So technology isn't just things, it's not just stuff like our computers or like tools for hunting, but it's also understanding new strategies and new ways of doing things. That's also technology. And so horticulturalists practice slash and burn. And sometimes we will hear in countries like Brazil and Argentina that the officials are trying to stop indigenous cultures from engaging in slash and burn because they're destroying the rainforest. But in fact, they're replenishing the rainforest. And it's really those who are running the government and who want those resources who suggest that slash and burn is negative, when in fact it's actually good for the earth and good for those communities. All members of the community also in horticulturalist societies know how and have the ability to use all tools. So it's not like there are some specialized areas or tools that only a few people, elite people, get to learn to use. They're all pretty equal. In terms of division of labor, because as hunting and gathering societies, the men hunted and the women gathered, that sort of evolves in horticultural societies into something sort of similar. Men plant crops and do the irrigation, which means bringing water through to the fields in larger sums. And women cultivate the crops, which means they go out and when the crops are ready to be picked, they pick those crops. Women care for family members, all family members, their in-laws, their older parents, their siblings, their nieces, their nephews, all the babies in the community. The men also engage in barter or trade, and they hunt a bit, but they don't need to hunt as much because they're able to grow their crops. And they, of course, do the slash and burn work, which is that harder work that is more dangerous if you have children with you. Hence, the women are with the children, nurturing the kids, and harvesting the food that brings most of the calories to the family, so their work is highly valued. And men engage in the activity of slashing and burning, which is more dangerous, and therefore you wouldn't have your children and your elderly with you while you're doing that. All members of these communities contribute to providing food, and food is their currency. Calories are how you weigh your worth, so to speak. And if you can produce calories, you've done a good day's job or a good day's work. In terms of quality of life and surplus or extras that they may have in society, their daily work is to maintain their crops for all members of that society. There's really no surplus or food or anything that's saved. They might trade with other bands that are in nearby areas that can grow different kinds of crops, but mostly they collect everything that they need, and with anything extra they may trade, or they trade with pastoralists. And we'll get to what pastoralists do, but they do some trade with pastoralists who do a great deal of hunting. Men manage the trade because they were out hunting. Now they're out further, leaving the home and engaging in any trade that might happen, and they protect the territory if needed. It really depends on where they lived. If there was a need to protect their area, they didn't have land ownership, but they would protect their crops in the area that their families and communities needed. With horticulturalist societies and with pastoralist societies, chiefs are selected. So with hunting and gathering, there are no chiefs. There's no one in charge other than they would revere those who were their elders to provide wisdom and knowledge. But with horticulturalists, with such large societies of 100 or more, they did have chiefs, and chiefs were selected based on their ability to equally and fairly distribute resources. So not based on any special qualities that they have or because they had more control, but actually based on their ability to support egalitarianism or equality, which is a pretty cool concept and not something that we're used to thinking of today. In terms of territories and land, there's still no notion of land ownership. They protect the space that they're working in, but they don't draw up a deed. They don't draw lines and say, this is mine and I own it. They work their land in their areas, and if other areas come close and appear to want to steal or take from them, then they'll engage in warfare. But they have no concept of owning land or owning property. Their territories are protected when they're close to their land territories from pastoralists if needed. Barter and trade of crops exists between bands and clans and with pastoralists, as we mentioned before. In terms of relationships or interpersonal relationships, there are no formal marriages here either. Without land ownership, there's no formal marriage. You will see as we get to the upcoming sections that marriage didn't exist until land ownership and great social inequality existed, and marriage then solidified who owned what and who would inherit what and therefore who would not. Children trace their lineage through mom and mom's side of the family in horticulturalist societies. Because there's no land to inherit, there's no need for legal marriage, and couples cohabitate but they may separate. Children stay with the maternal family and typically remain in those bands of the mom's side of the family as adults. And in fact, in horticulturalist societies, their uncles usually play the role that we would consider a fatherly role in Western societies in the United States. They're the ones that teach the children the norms and the values and the expectations. And fathers seem more like what we would consider uncles. They're more the ones who come and go a bit more. They're fun-loving and entertaining, but not necessarily the ones who are teaching them the ways of day-to-day living and values and norms. Larger bands have more conflict among groups when resources are more scarce and if people specialize in their work as they become larger. If there are warring bands or conflicts with other groups, more conflict and less equality exists among the horticulturalist groups. So you're hopefully seeing this trend that as societies get larger, they divide the labor up more. Sometimes that equality diminishes and there's more likely to be conflict, possibly even leading to war. Now let's talk about pastoralists. So we talked about how hunters and gatherers were in semi-arid areas where they had enough resources that they could gather and hunt to feed their groups of 25 to 50. But as they moved and grew and tried things out and learned, some found their way into tropical versus subtropical areas and became horticulturalists and found a way to stay put and grow in numbers, as we just described. Others found themselves working more towards arid or desert lands, and those folks became pastoralists. Pastoralists make a living by animal herding and animal domestication, which is the breeding of animals, in particular livestock. There's minimal gathering and there's some trading and bartering. They also can grow into bands that are the hundreds, so usually smaller than horticulturalists, because they do move as resources change. Pastoralists can also be in tundra, cold areas, not just what we think of when we think of deserts and the Kalahari Desert or the Sahara Desert and warm areas, but they can also be in tundra-like areas like Mongolia, Russia, and parts of Asia like that. They also use simple tools for herding and animal husbandry or breeding of animals. And they were herding and breeding animals like cows, yak, buffalo, camels, dromedary, llamas, alpacas, and also animals like pigs. And they did start to domesticate dogs to help them in their herding. With the division of labor, women gathered less than 10% of the calories consumed. So when we talked about horticulturalists, it was really sort of considered a 50-50 job. The men made sure that everything was planted, and they did a little bit of hunting, and they'd collect a few animals that they might keep, like small pigs or chickens. And women then did the harvesting of the food and helped with some of those other activities as well, including helping feed the animals that they kept in their homes. Here with pastoralists, there's no keeping of small animals close to the home because the home is constantly moving, and there's very little gathering because they live in arid areas, whether they're cold tundra-like or they're hot desert-like. And so women gathered less than 10% of the calories consumed, and men gather 90% of the calories consumed. Again, women were bound to breastfeeding in all of these cultures and the activities of childbearing, and so which led to breastfeeding. And if you couldn't make a living while also doing that, it had an impact on sort of your value within a society. Men raise and produce most food needed through herding and animal production. So what they do to make a living is the most valuable thing that happens within the household in terms of staying alive. Women care for children and families at home, while men travel to obtain necessities and protect their territories. And men traded with other pastoralists and also horticulturalists. As well, pastoralists were nomadic, so they didn't build permanent homes like horticulturalists did. Their homes were more like what hunters and gatherers built that could be moved, but even more movable, more transient. When you see images of caravans with camels and sort of older wagon type structures and people riding on sheep, on horses, on camels, etc. Those are really images of pastoralists. And the work of the women was to raise the children and to make clothing and to make weapons and things out of the resources that men collected, as well as, of course, to prepare all the food. In terms of the quality of life and any sort of surplus that might exist for pastoralists, they live in harsh climates in a very nomadic or moving lifestyle, moving with the seasons so that they can get whatever resources they can in an area before they have to go again as the seasons change to collect more resources. Usually in similar circles, Native Americans in the United States from sort of the middle of the U.S., north of Arkansas, more the Midwest and the northern states, all the way through much of Canada, many of which were pastoralists if they were not able to maintain crops throughout an entire season. So they became pastoralist types of societies. And there we saw more use of horses and buffalo for their transportation, as well as just transportation on foot. Like surplus of items, there was little surplus of items like furs and pelts, which were traded with horticulturalists and other pastoralist societies. Women did not produce goods to be sold or consumed. Everything that they did was for the home. Therefore, there was not a monetary value attached to their work, and therefore, the status of women in pastoralist societies is among the lowest across the globe. They would refine these resources, but men produced them, and nearly all needed goods for daily consumption and trading were also found, gathered, and produced by men, having an impact on the quality of life, which was very different and is very different for men and women for those who still exist as pastoralists. In terms of territories and land, there's no legal land ownership also with pastoralists, and it probably makes the most sense with them. They really were nomadic and moving. And if you think about traditional Native American cultures and how they see the earth as being sort of a spirit rather than something you can own, pastoralists didn't think you could own or draw a line on lands. They wanted to be able to have access to the resources that they needed, but they didn't think that they owned a piece of land, but they would defend an area if they only had enough resources in that area for their community that was traveling. Nomadic societies moved their homes and regions throughout their home regions to gather scarce vegetation and to graze their animals. Also, you would see sheep and goats with them because they produced a lot of milk and other dairy products that they could keep and use. And animals that produce milk became very important to pastoralists first before any other society type, because an animal that's alive, that stays with you, that can produce milk every day, can produce protein. And not only protein, as animals eat grass and other foliage, they're taking in micronutrients that human beings are consuming through the milk. And so the dairy products were absolutely critical to pastoralists, and they're how they came into human diets. And if you look at different cultures that have more lactose intolerance, those who are not lactose intolerant are much more likely to have evolved from pastoralist societies or have that in their genetic makeup. Those who are lactose intolerant are far less likely to have pastoralist societies in their genetic makeup. Because resources are scarce and land is absolutely necessary for them to survive for grazing, pastoralists are more likely to defend territory and engage in conflict than the other two society types that we've talked about so far. And barter and trade with other groups is very common. So among pastoralist societies, day-to-day life was challenging and difficult. So if you think of the Han and the Mongols of northern Asia, and if you think of some of the more warring Native American tribes in the United States, as well as some of the tribes of the Middle East, throughout the Saudi Peninsula, as well as near the not the Kalahari Desert, but northern Africa, there's a greater history of war and territorialism because there just aren't as many resources in these arid places. And so people had to fight for their access to those resources more than hunters and gatherers did, and more than horticulturalists did. In terms of relationships, you can already see a picture that's being painted by what we're describing. Marriage is not formal because there's no land ownership. Because women, children, and the aged do not herd and produce animals, their position in society is significantly less than men. Scarce access to resources leads to competition within a society and between societies. And for this reason, men produce for their families only. So they weren't producing for the community overall, but produced for their families and, of course, their extended family, leading them to need to know who their children are. So the slide says how their children are, but really it's who their children are because they're scarce resources. So they need to know exactly who their kids are, the paternity of their kids, so they know who it is that they need to provide for. Women are confined to husbands' households and raise their children and care for their husband's parents. Again, when there are scarce resources or when a society has less access to resources, we see more conflict, less equality, and more division of labor, and more and less respect for different segments of society, in particular in terms of gender and age within societies, like we see with the pastoralists.